I would assume it was going to start with 1, but I didn't know it was just assume.
Yeah, it's yeah, true.
Yeah?
Yep. That's good. Not the full rest.
Okay.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
We're just handing out a pre-test. So if you're going to take the same test at the end. It's not graded. It's just for us to know whether we're doing our job and you guys are learning. So if you'll just take a few minutes to complete it, and then we'll get started in just a little bit. Excuse me.
I did too. Oh, that one. What was he claiming? Evidence. There's a picture. The funny information. It's something for the last month. But I mean, that was that time. With ANC. I tested the good and the bad side off. Okay. Yes. Here's a good.
For those of you that just came in, we're just going to take a few minutes and fill out the pretest that's with your binder. We've had a couple changes to the schedule this morning, so Dr. Shawley's not going to be here. That gives us about another extra 15 minutes in our schedule.
True.
And then Penny, Jester, and I think we're going to swap presentations this morning just for the conflict that she has. So just take a few minutes. There's breakfast out there. Bathrooms are out to the right. I'll give you just another couple minutes to finish up the pretest. We don't grade the pretest. You'll take the same exact test at the end of today. We just want to make sure that what the objectives are of the course we're actually meeting. So you don't have to put your name on it, but just take a few minutes to complete it for us.
True. I know that person. I'm already thinking about this. I'm sorry.
Does anybody else need a pen?
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
That's fun. Anybody else need a pen? We'll go ahead and get started. We'll have a break around 9:40. You guys can finish up the pre-test then. And then when at the break, just take them in. We'll put them at the front. We'll collect them at the front. So my name is Cindy Joyner. I am currently the Assistant Vice Chair in the Department of Medicine. I'm the Assistant Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Medicine. And I'm an Assistant Professor in Cardiology. So a lot of my experience in clinical research has been about 15 years, and it's all been in a variety of roles in clinical research. So anywhere from working in the lab, processing samples, to managing regulatory, to doing budgets and contracts, to being a coordinator myself, managing a research program, and then designing and implementing, building clinical research programs in the department. So I've had this wide variety of experiences, and then now being an investigator myself. My background is nursing, and my PhD is in nursing. And like many people, I never thought I would end up in clinical research, and I did, and I love it, and I have this passion for it. And you'll meet a number of people today who have been involved in clinical research, either here at the university or have come to the university in the past few years and have this passion for clinical research as well. Penny Jester is the one that has really spearheaded education for research on campus, and this kind of grew out of some other programs that she had developed, and she pulled some of this into it a number of years ago. And if you know Penny, or you get to know Penny, once she pulls you into a project, you can't get out. But we all, we felt that there was this huge gap of knowledge for research on campus, and so this is one of the first programs, if you're new to research or new to UAB, that we encourage people to take. And then we have several other programs. So this is just to highlight where the institution and UAB really is going with training. And so if you're coming into research or coming into the university, one of the first steps you would take would be completing your GCP, or your Good Clinical Practice training, and your IRB training, which is your HSP training. And then we would encourage people to complete this program, which is a research orientation program. And this is a broad overview. So if you're new to research, you're going to hear a lot of acronyms today. It's just a big picture of the overall scope. And then from this course, we would want you or encourage you to complete other courses. It also, just based on how the course is built, it tends to focus a little bit on drug studies, but all the principles apply to all types of research involving humans across the spectrum. So behavioral research, outcomes research, device studies, even retrospective chart reviews, all those types of things. When we're talking about clinical research and research dealing with human subjects, these principles apply across the board. So we might use a certain type of study to get a point across, but please know it applies to all types of research. From this course, usually within 6 months of kind of getting your feet wet, being in that position, we would encourage you, based on your role, to take either the research training program, which is the RTP, or the PI training. And this is highlighted as pending, but we're actually getting ready to kick off our first PI training next week. And so the PI training has been developed for clinical investigators. The first pilot of it is about 15 people. And so we kept it small so we could see how it works, make sure that it's, we've got all the kinks out, that it's useful, it's productive, and then we'll offer that course again in the fall. The research training program is offered every 6 months, spring and fall. It's for any member of the research team. So if it's regulatory finance, coordinator, any kind of staff or administration position, that's really where we want those types of positions, roles, people to go. It's specific to UAB, so you are going to learn a lot about research more in depth in that course, but you're also going to meet a lot of the people at UAB that you would work with, network with, those types of things. So you can help build some of those relationships, put faces with names, those kinds of things. And it is a 6-week course. It's a half a day, once a week for 6 weeks. After that, there's this continuous training, and this is something we keep tweaking on campus, but right now we have a Thursday, 1st and 3rd seminar series from 12 to 1. It's here in PCAMS. It depends. Every week is a different topic. We try to keep a theme around a month, but depending on what's going on campus or in the research world, we might change that a little bit. So in the beginning of the month, we had a session on effort reporting. We had one on clinicaltrials.gov. February 2nd, we have a 2-hour workshop, which normally they're 1-hour sessions, but we're doing a 2-hour hands-on workshop about completing your HSP or putting together your IRB application. So that's February 2nd from 11 to 1. It'll be here. The announcement will probably go out today. If it was supposed to go out yesterday, but it'll probably go out today. You register for it, and it's a very interactive workshop the way we've designed it. So if you haven't done an HSP or an IRB application, or you're new to that, I would encourage you to try and attend that as well. But we are trying to figure out what the needs are for research staff and investigators on campus and highlight those and discuss those topics through this continuous training. So it's an introductory course. I've kind of highlighted what it's intended to do, but we're going to go through different aspects of implementing a study and providing basic guidelines for how you manage and implement, run, oversee a clinical trial or a human subject study. I kind of talked about this a little bit. Sorry, this is usually the part that Penny does. It's not a how-to. Like I said, we're giving you a broad picture of what research is and approaching it from being a new person on campus or new to research. And looking at truly the clinical, good clinical practice guidelines and things that you really need to be aware of as you're going into research. So the first thing that we want to do is just make clear when we talk about a clinical trial, we're using the NIH definition. If you're not familiar with the NIH definition, it's here, and it's a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. This is also the definition that the university is using when we talk about clinical trials. And so it's not just a randomized trial where you're providing a drug or a device to somebody. It really is a broad definition of a clinical trial. It goes into a little more detail, and you have these in your handouts and your slides, so I'll let you read those. But there is this definition that NIH came out with, and it's just good to be familiar with what that definition is. Being new to research, what we're going to make sure you hopefully walk away with is understanding a general flow of research. So reviewing a new protocol, determining if you can do it. Is it feasible? This is something that we tend to not do the best job at, and so we need to make sure that, if it's a study that we're interested in, can we actually do this study? And we'll walk through a little bit later how to determine if it's really feasible to conduct a study or not. How to obtain that contract execution and IRB approval, implementing a study, maintaining a study, and closing a study. And that's kind of how we've outlined the flow for today in the agenda. We want to make sure that you know the rules, and research is constantly changing between whatever sponsor you're working with, or if the IRBs come out with new rules, or the FDA or whoever is providing guidance, and it does change, but it's important to know the rules that are there and be familiar where you can find them and have a basic understanding of these. So we'll talk about the International Conference on Harmonization and Good Clinical Practices, the ICH-GCP, you might hear that a lot, the IRB, so the Institutional Review Board, standard operating procedures for your office, we'll talk about those, the Belmont Report, Helsinki, our institutional requirements, industry requirements, and the requirements by a government agency. So if you're working with NIH, FDA, whoever your funding source might be for one of those grants or clinical trials or research studies, you need to be aware of those. And there are a lot of acronyms. Just to give me a feel, how many are totally new to research? Okay. How many are investigators? How many are coordinators? Regulatory? Finance? Lab? Okay. Oh wait, lab? Okay. We want to make sure you understand the definition of human subjects research, understand the scope of really protecting human subjects. And sometimes when we think about protecting human subjects, we think about the people that come in direct contact with those patients or participants, and we need to think about the whole team. And we'll highlight that today. So everybody from financial, regulatory, lab, anybody that's touching any of that research data, any of that research information, you have a role in protecting human subjects and defining those good clinical practices for conducting research. So for research, it's a systematic investigation including research development, testing, and evaluation, and it's designed to develop or contribute to the generalizable knowledge. This is important to keep in your mind when you're conducting research, especially if you're a healthcare provider. So if you're a clinician, if you're a nurse, if you're another type of healthcare provider, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, whatever, and we'll talk more about this, there's a clear distinction between providing that patient care as a provider and providing research care. The scope of protecting human subjects in any research, clinical, non-clinical, educational, observation, registry, any type of human subject study, human subject protection comes first, and safety comes first. And protecting human subjects should be at the forefront. And it begins even before the study begins, and it ends after the manuscript or the results of the study have been published. So it's a continuous process, and we just need to keep that in our mind because sometimes that can get away from us a little bit. So how do we protect human subjects? With the Design of the study is the most important. When we're designing a study, writing a protocol, creating that protocol study, we need to think about the design and how we're going to keep patients safe. It's reviewed by our local IRB. They look at the ethical portions of that study to make sure that things are being conducted ethically. You might have a scientific review committee in your area that's separate from that, and they're looking at the science and making sure that it is designed properly. We have protocol-defined safety measures. So for most drug studies, device studies, we have the FDA involved. And the FDA reviews these protocols to make sure that the subject safety is adequate and that it's included in the proper parts of that study. If it's a behavioral study, you need to consider safety when it's related to any type of intervention that you're doing. So thinking of those questionnaires, those assessments, things that the patients are going to be interacting with, we still need to think about safety and reducing the risks and keeping a broad idea of, really what those risks are. And sometimes it takes another person in the team or another colleague to look at that protocol and bring up other risks that you might not be thinking about. And trained research staff, and that's where a lot of this training that we've developed through the institution has been really critical. You can't expect people to conduct research and maintain and uphold all of these rules, guidelines, and protect patients if they're not trained. So that's where we've tried to offer more and more training on campus for people involved in research. We talk about who's responsible for protecting human subjects. That's where I said a lot of times we think of those people just in direct contact with the participant, and that's not the case. It's the entire team involved in conducting that study and all the agencies surrounding it. So the IRB has some responsibility for it. Your department has some responsibility for it. The FDA, if they're involved. So you need to think broad on who interacts with this research study and their role in keeping participants safe. We're going to talk for a few minutes about clinical care versus research care. And this is a very challenging area. They've actually done a lot of research in this area, and there's a lot of articles on this. But the clinical care that you provide as a provider is an activity that is between that patient and his or her doctor. And that's a really simple way to think about it. But when you're a patient, you have joint decision-making with your provider. You can choose not to take a certain medication. You can talk about your best clinical process, what you're going to have done. You are involved in the decisions, and the outcome of those decisions is based solely on that patient. So if you are the patient, it's to your benefit, no one else's. The research you have to think about as a public activity. And so the difference is the activity that occurs between the research subject or participant and the principal investigator, the research team, is voluntary. So there's not joint decision making there. There's a protocol, and that protocol needs to be followed. Now sometimes we deviate from that for safety reasons, but when somebody decides to participate in a clinical trial, they are following a systematic process. The activities are public, they follow the protocol, and the outcome of those activities are for the benefit of the entire public. So there's not that we can change this for this particular patient, we can change, we're not going to do this procedure, or we're going to draw an extra tube of blood here, or we're going to look at this. You can't change the protocol per patient. If there is a change made, you have to have approval to do that. It might require that the patient comes or the participant comes out of the study. So you need to really understand that there's this difference between research care and clinical care. And that can be challenging, especially if it's somebody who's been in this provider world, whether it's a physician, clinician, nurse, you're used to having a certain relationship with the patient. And you have to, when you're doing research, wear your clinician hat or your provider hat, and then you have to switch gears and wear your research hat. And that can be challenging sometimes. That's where we come up with this idea of therapeutic misconception. And so where it's confusing for those providing the care, it's also very confusing for those receiving the care. And making sure that you have this conversation with patients or participants explaining kind of this difference in roles. And so you're a clinical practitioner and you're a clinical researcher, and you cannot be both at the same time for a patient. This again just highlights, it's a joint decision with standard of care. In research, you're following kind of the scripted clinical care. And this highlights some of the research that's been done where this is a true problem with participants or patients. And so if you've been a provider to a certain patient for a number of years and you say, hey, I have this research study we want you to enroll in, it's placebo-based, so you're either going to get a placebo, a sugar pill, or you're going to get the real drug. Many patients, if they've had that relationship with the provider, might think, well, my doctor isn't going to give me a sugar pill. They're my doctor. They're going to make sure I get the real thing. And so you have to really take that time when we talk about informed consent and talk about that today. You have to make it very clear to the patient the difference in your role as a researcher and a provider and the difference in their role as a patient and a participant. So one way to make sure that you do that and help you understand how to do that is following good clinical practice guidelines. And we're going to refer to that as GCPs. So good clinical practice guidelines provide guidelines to researchers to assure the rights of study subjects are protected. And they provide guidelines to assure that they're accurate and reliable collection of data. They strengthen the ethical and scientific standards and, when adhered to, enhance the quality of human subjects. And many times, it's not that most people don't purposefully not adhere to GCPs. Many times, it's a lack of understanding of the GCPs. The GCPs are actually fairly reasonable to read and understand. We'll talk about some of the other regulations that are a little dry and hard to interpret, but GCPs are good. They're good guidance. They're usually in a language that you can understand, and you really need to be familiar with them. And we wonder sometimes, we have all these rules and regulations and things change in research as for a lot of reasons, but it seems like what a lot of regulations come from and a lot of changes in research come from is a result of tragedies. And so it might be a public tragedy or fraud or abuse of human rights, but this is where these come from. And so we have this ongoing development of documents and regulations based on things that have happened in the past. One of the examples that we've talked about in this course is there was a study conducted here at the university a number of years ago. It was with neonates or premature babies, and the study was looking at how much oxygen level do we provide a premature baby when they're in the hospital. And so normal was keeping them within like 90 to 100. And so this study was going to determine, was it better to keep them at 90% to 95% oxygen level, or should they put them at 95 to 99% oxygen level? The study was approved by the NIH. It was approved by the IRB. They had this consent. It seemed all kosher. It seemed fine. Everybody was, implementing the study. Well, they came back a number of years later, and parents were upset that they didn't realize that if their child was placed in the arm of the study that was 95 to 99%, they had a risk of vision loss. And so that was outlined in the consent form, but it wasn't as clear as it probably should be. So as a result of that, here at the university, the IRB now requires when you put your consent form in, you have to put in all the risks in one section, and you have to identify it by arms in your study. So if your study has 2 arms or 3 arms, for each arm of that study, you have to be very clear in what the risks are, depending on which part of the study they go in. So that's something that, it's constantly changing, and it's usually changing because something has happened. And so that's where you need to keep up to date with when things do change and have an understanding of why they change, because it will help you in your process of either consenting patients or analyzing data or building a study. With the GCPs, there are 2 other types of regulations that we look at. So we look at the Code of Federal Regulations and we look at ICH GCPs. If you're new to research and you're starting to learn some of these things, the Code of Federal Regulations is a very dry document. It's not an interesting read. It can be challenging. There are certain parts that you need to be very familiar with, and we'll highlight those today. But coming into it new, I would encourage you to look at the ICH GCP regulations and taking those first, reading through those. They seem to be a lot easier to read. They came out of a committee through Europe. They're not the true guidelines for the United States. We follow the federal regulations, but they're very similar. But the ICH is very much easier to read. So I say start with the ICH, become familiar with it, and then start looking at your Code of Federal Regulations. And it's not like you're going to sit down at night with a cup of coffee and read your federal regulations. But we'll tell you kind of which ones you really need to be aware of. Following GCPs, they do all these things for us. And being new to research or involved in research, you need to follow the guidelines and be familiar with them. There's the overall goal of all of them is to protect human subjects. So we have laws that we're obligated to adhere to. We have regulations and mandatory requirements. We have guidelines which help investigators, researchers, study team members understand the importance of why they're doing what they're doing, and we have guidance to help with that. And then we have, training and audits and compliance manuals. And so in your binder, we have a section that is all acronyms because we use a lot of acronyms in research. And I know when I first started in research, people just threw these acronyms out. I was like, what the heck is that? It's like alphabet soup. But you have a handout where we tried to compile all the acronyms that we can think of. And there's still some that people throw out. What is that? I have to go look. But we use a lot of them. When we implement GCPs, we're implementing them across the spectrum of a study. So, like I said, from the time that you start designing the study to the time that you're reporting data on your study. You cannot read this slide, but I promise you it's in your handout. It's the 13 principles of the ICH GCPs, and we'll go over those a little bit more. But it might be something that you want to keep handy for a while. It's always something to refer back to, but these are the 13 principles we'll talk a little bit more later about. So one of the big things that we want you to take away from the class, or at least the beginning portion of the class, is really truly understanding there's this difference in clinical care and research care. Because if you can understand that there is a true difference and kind of catch yourself when you see that you might be blurring those lines, it'll make you a better study team member, a better researcher, and help you distinguish your role in how you talk to patients and participants, and also how you interpret situations. We always want to put the patient safety first, but there are things you just have to make sure you understand clinical care and research care. And then truly understand the principles of good clinical practice and where to go. I think one of the biggest things from this class is we want you to walk away. By noon, you're going to be overwhelmed probably, especially if you're new, but we want you to walk away with what you feel like you have resources and knowing where you can go next based on your role in the study team. Questions so far? So we're going to do just a couple questions. The PI just talked to a patient. They met study entry criteria into a study that you're working on. The PI comes to you and says the patient agreed to be in the study. When you go into the room and approach the patient refuses. What would you do? How would you handle that? It happens a lot.
Make sure they understand first.
Right.
Make sure that they understand that their safety is very important to you and wouldn't put them at risk of anything that could potentially harm them or come in between their care with their doctor.
I think to understand why they're refusing, so that you can address that.
Right. And anybody else? Any other comments?
If you would ask what their concerns are, what other information do they need to know?
So, I mean, as a coordinator, I encountered it a lot. Patients will seem to say yes to their physicians a lot, but then once that physician leaves the room, they think about it a little bit more, and then they want to say no. So all of your answers are right. And that, asking them specifically, telling them what your role is, whether you're the coordinator, sub-investigator, what your role is in the study team, how you work with the investigator, asking them what their concerns are, and trying to address those concerns and helping them understand. And if they say no, that's fine. They have the right to say no. Then you have to go back to that investigator and tell them, they said no and this is why. If the investigator chooses to go back in and talk to that patient, I would try to go with the investigator, because sometimes you can get into a situation where the investigator is in there and they say one thing, the coordinator goes in and they say another. So if you go in separately to begin with, the next time you go as a team. And that shows the patient or the participant as well that you're working together. And they might be more inclined to ask more questions and those types of things. But if they say no, ultimately it is their decision. And so sometimes the harder part is telling the investigator they said no. So if you're working on a study and the PI says that for this subject, this specific subject, he or she wants to change the entry criteria so that the patient who's currently not eligible would be eligible and could be enrolled in the study. This happens a lot too. What would you say to the investigator?
We can't do that.
So I've learned over the years, just saying, well, no, we can't do that, doesn't always go well.
You could say call the medical monitor, but I haven't seen that.
And that's where I think years ago in research, sponsors would allow more changes or more flexibility, and that's just not the way it is anymore. So you have to tell the investigator, no, we can't do that. But if this is something you want to do in the future, and they've written the protocol or they've been involved in the protocol, let's sit down and talk about how we could change that and go to the IRB for approval. If it's an industry study, they didn't write the protocol, you can say, well, we can call and talk to the medical monitor or the monitor, but they're really not making a lot of changes, but I'm happy to call and talk to them. However, we need to follow the protocol today. So giving them some more information about why that patient can't be enrolled today is probably very critical and helps that relationship and communication. But they can't put them in. So during which part of study implementation do you worry about human subject safety and collecting good data? All of it. For which kinds of study with human subjects do good clinical practices apply?
All of them.
All of them. Trick questions. Okay, if you get back to your office today and you think, okay, I want to look for 3 sources of GCP, they talked about it, I need to look it up and become a little more familiar. Where are 3 places you could look? The IRB website. You could go to the FDA website. A lot of times, if you have an industry study, there's in the back of the protocol, there's resources, and there should be something listed there. And then in your book, we have a website and a copy of the ICH guidelines. Any questions on that? Any questions at all? Okay, so I'm going to talk about roles and responsibilities, and then you guys get a break. And feel free as we go through today, if you have questions, please stop and ask. Several of us will be here throughout the day. Some of us are coming and going, but feel free to stop any of us. Also in your binder, you have contact information for all the speakers. You're welcome to reach out to any of us afterwards and ask us questions. If you need more guidance on where you need to go for more information, anything like that, you're welcome to contact us and we'll help you maneuver your way through and get you what you need. So when we talk about roles and responsibilities, we're talking about the whole study team, and we're going to kind of walk through all these different members of the study team. And I understand that what we're going to talk about is this team. However, some areas consist of an investigator as your team. Some are an investigator and a coordinator. Some of you might be in an area where it's a large program and you've got a regulatory person, a financial person, a data manager, several sub-investigators, all different parts of your study team. So when we talk about the roles and responsibilities of each member, I understand that there might be some of you that have more than one of those roles or responsibilities. Remember when I started out in research, as a coordinator, I was regulatory, financial, and a coordinator. And then as I transitioned into other roles, sometimes I was the coordinator in just clinical care. Sometimes I was the manager overseeing it. So, depending on your area and who your team is, you might have more than one role. The person that bears the ultimate responsibility is the PI. And we used to joke that PI stood for practically invisible, but I don't really think that's the case anymore. We have really engaged investigators. If you feel like you are an investigator and you're not as engaged as what you like and you need guidance on how to do that, there are mentors in other areas on campus that we can plug you into where you can kind of get that mentorship and training. If you are working for an investigator and you don't think that they're engaged, then we have some tips and can help you kind of figure out how to have those communications with the investigator and work with them to make it work as a team. So the objectives of this particular talk is to identify human participant protections from the perspective and investigator responsibilities. We're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of each team member, and we're going to define the contents and scope of the FDA 1572. So for those does anybody know what the 1572 is? This is a form the FDA uses for investigational drugs. And so we're using it as an example of the commitments that an investigator agrees to when they agree to participate in a study. So even though we're going to talk about this specific form, the commitments and the information on this form apply to all studies across the spectrum. We just use this because it's a really clear form and it has some good information on it. And then we're going to touch on scientific misconduct. So when you think about the players who make up the team, you need to think broad. And like I said earlier, you need to think about everybody who touches the research. So it's the principal investigator, sub-investigators, any study coordinator. And the study coordinator can be a nurse or a non-nurse. You might have that financial person, a regulatory person, data person. And don't forget about the lab, the pharmacy, radiology, all these other areas that help conduct the study. You need to think really broad. And as you know, this is just to highlight the members of the team have to work together. And we'll talk throughout the day about communication, and you'll hear the word team a lot, but finding a way for your research team to stay in touch and know what's going on in regards to protocol changes, participants, anything important to the study, your whole team needs to be aware of. So we're going to start with the PI, and the PI, like I said, is ultimately responsible. They oversee every single aspect of the study. They delegate roles and responsibilities, and a good PI is going to delegate. You have to delegate in order to get the study conducted. You adhere to that 1572 or the commitments within the 1572, which we'll talk about. PI is ultimately responsible for any scientific misconduct. Since they are responsible for the study and everything that the team members do as part of that study, they are the ones that if there's scientific misconduct within that study, that the PI is the one that bears that. They have to be present and involved, and they have to communicate with staff and study participants regularly. This comes from NIH, but it outlines what the PI is responsible for. Conducting objective research is critical. Managing the integrity of the data in the study, including the design and reporting. And then responsible for direction and oversight of compliance. And that's in all regards, financial, personnel, ethical, all aspects of compliance. As we go down talking about the PI, it is important to understand that at the institution here at UAB, OSP, so the Office of Sponsored Programs, the group that conducts or executes contracts, they have a specific definition of what a PI is. And that is based on who can have a contract with NIH or industry or whoever. What we're talking about today in regards to PI is a PI that can be over a project in terms of submitting an IRB proposal and responsible for the conduct of the study. So just know if you have a new investigator or a fellow, a trainee, something like that, that wants to get involved in research, you need to be aware of who the contract can lie with, because it can be different from who the IRB lies with. Does that make sense? But what we have in here is the definition for contractual agreements and how OSP sees a PI.
Do they allow contracts allow with graduate students?
No. So the contract would have to be with a tenured or a full-time faculty or full-time staff. But the IRB will allow an IRB with a graduate student if they have a mentor. So that's kind of where you have to be aware of the two differences. But what we're focusing on today is the IRB portion of it. There's a wide range of scope of PI responsibilities, and when we go, we'll look at this, but then when we get to the coordinator, you're going to see those scope of responsibilities are very similar. So the PI has scientific responsibilities and they have general administrative responsibilities. And a lot of times as an investigator, we tend to focus on the scientific part. We're focused on getting the science right and conducting the science. And we tend to forget about the administrative sometimes, just because it's, we're thinking science. So as an investigator, you really need to think about all aspects of the study. So yes, the conduct of the research, preparation of those protocols, preparation and review of progress reports, those types of things. But when you think about administrative, you have to think about facilities, project closeout, space, training for your staff, financial. So you have to be thinking about those things as well. And the 1572 is where we're going to kind of outline the commitments that the investigator has when he or she agrees to conduct a study. So with this specific form, like I said, it's an FDA form, and it's specific to investigational drugs. There are similar forms for behavioral research, for device studies, but they're not a template like the FDA has. So if you're doing a device study, sponsors can create their own form. They're not going to call it a 1572. They usually call it an investigator agreement or investigator responsibilities. The same with behavioral research, but a lot of them outline the same information. So they complete the 1572 if it's a drug study, because it's a contract between the sponsor and the investigator to make sure that they're going to conduct the study the way it needs to be conducted. And it provides that sponsor with information about the site that they need in order to make sure that the site is qualified, the investigator is qualified, the staff is qualified to conduct the study. When you look at the 1572, it asks for some basic information: PI name, address. They need documentation of their expertise. So you need to have a copy of their CV on file. The research facilities. And when we talk about research facilities, again, think about all areas on campus that your research touches. So you might have your office in the Whitaker building, but you see patients in Kirkland, and then you conduct procedures in the hospital. And maybe they go to the Eye Foundation for eye exams. So every place that your research touches needs to be listed on this 1572. If you're not doing a drug study, then that information still needs to be listed in a document in your records. You talk about laboratories, again, all laboratories. Maybe that whatever study you're conducting uses a central laboratory, and that laboratory is in Boston. But in order to get the specimens there, you know, the CCTS is processing them for you over in the hospital. So you need to make sure that you list where all the areas the labs have touched. So you might have sometimes 2 or 3 labs. The IRB. Here we have one IRB. However, we can utilize more than that IRB based on your study. Typically anything that's industry funded clinical trial can use Western IRB. You still submit to our IRB here at UAB. They look at it and then they send it on to Western IRB. And then from that point forward, a lot of your correspondence is with Western. If it's an investigator-initiated project, a fellow project, usually unfunded or grant-funded projects, they stay here at UAB. There are some caveats to that. Genetic studies, probably DNA. There's some other ones that might stay here. So, you know, make sure you know what your study is looking at and look at the IRB website and forms to figure out where it goes. If you're not sure, call the IRB. They're going to be able to tell you which one it goes to. But typically industry funded goes to Western, others stay here. They did that a number of years ago because the IRB here was just so overwhelmed. It was taking forever to get things approved. And when we contracted with Western, it sped up the process for industry approvals. You want to make sure you list sub-investigators. And these are all people that are involved in the actual conduct and science of the study. So, you know, if you have somebody that you're working with, a colleague that is helping conduct the study, interpret results, those types of things, they need to be listed on here. And then the protocol information. What we're going to look at, and this is very small, but I'm going to highlight it on separate slides. They need a protocol summary, which you'll have, commitments of the PI, which we're about to go over in a minute, and then there's this section at the bottom where the investigator signs and dates. And so when they sign and date that, they're saying they agree to all of these commitments, all 8 of them, and if they don't follow those commitments, they understand that there's criminal offense involved and that they could have issues with that. So we're going to go over oversight and what those commitments mean. And so when we talk about oversight with investigators, it can be, there are so many things that as an investigator you are responsible for, and you need to have a system and a way to manage those and know what's going on and still conduct your research. Knowing that many times investigators delegate, and that's okay. You need to delegate in order to conduct the research, but when they're delegated, the investigator is still ultimately responsible for those. So when we talk about what an investigator commits to when they sign up for a study, number 1, they're going to follow the protocol. That means you're going to follow the eligibility criteria, you're going to follow those study visits and timeline, conduct the assessments the way that it's outlined in the protocol. You're going to make sure that the dosing is done the way that it says in the protocol. You know, the patient's not going to be on medication they're not supposed to be on, and that you are going to collect the data to reach the endpoint, the ultimate endpoint of that study. You agree to personally conduct and supervise the study, and this can be challenging, but you know the protocol. And sometimes your coordinator is going to know the protocol better than you, and that's okay, you're a team. But you need to know the protocol, be familiar with it, have a copy of it, know what you need to refer to. You need to be available and involved, especially if you're delegating. You might be in clinic several days, but you're still available by phone, regular meetings, pager, whatever. You see the patients, and when we talk about recruiting in a study and retaining patients in the study, the more often they see that investigator involved in the study, the more likely you're going to have a better recruitment record, and you're going to be able to retain patients, participants throughout the study because they know that that physician is involved. You're going to review documents. As we go into an electronic world, research still has a ton of paper, and there's a lot of signing that needs to be done and a lot of review by investigators. Knowing what the staff is doing, and we'll talk more about communication, but you really need to know what the staff is doing. You're ultimately responsible. You don't want to micromanage. That's not going to accomplish anything. But have some type of regular meeting. Make it a productive meeting. Some type of communication with your staff so you know what's going on. If there are issues, challenges, good things, bad things. Being involved in recruiting and consenting, and knowing the protocol metrics. And consenting is definitely one of the tasks that investigators delegate. But you shouldn't delegate a task, especially consenting, unless you know how to do it yourself. And I will say a lot of the errors and issues that I've seen in my role with new investigators is they do not understand the consenting process. If you've been a clinical provider and you're used to consenting in the hospital for procedures, you do a good job, but it's 1 page or 2 pages, and it's usually pretty quick. With a study consent, the consent can be anywhere from 15 to 30 pages long. And you have to take the time to go through that process, and you have to make sure you document that process. I had an investigator, he was a wonderful faculty, wonderful physician, very excited about getting his research off the ground. He didn't feel he needed any help. He was doing the study on his own, and the IRB had to suspend his research because of his consenting. He did it. He did a good job of talking to the patients. Knowing him, he did a good job, but it was not documented, and consents were not organized and in a place where we could have all of them. So it's one of those things, we had to halt his research because we had to reconsent patients. We had to get a system in place for him so that he knew where all his consents were, that they were all signed properly, that they were dated properly. So it seems like an administrative task that doesn't have any meaning, but to the IRB it has a huge meaning. And so you don't want something like that to halt your research. He ended up having to, he couldn't collect some of the pilot data he needed to submit a grant, so it threw him off, a whole 6 months. So it can make a big impact in your research. So make sure you understand consenting. I've talked about consenting. Make sure you understand consenting. And make sure you understand it's a process. And once you know how to do it and you delegate that task, make sure that your team, your study team, is trained properly on how to do that. And if there are issues with consenting, make sure they're addressed. They're talked about openly, and you come up with a plan to prevent those issues from happening again. Because probably 50% of issues with FDA audits, IRB issues, go back to consenting. As an investigator, you're going to commit to adverse event reporting. So if something goes wrong with the patient or participant while they're in the study, you are going to report that that happened. And this is where the investigator has to have a key role. They are responsible for attributing the level of the adverse event, the seriousness of it, and the causality. That is not something your study team can do for you. Your study team can help you. They can provide you with all the data. They can collect everything, talk to the participant, look at the protocol, pull all the stuff together, but it's ultimately the investigator's responsibility in determining, the adverse event and if it's expected or unexpected. Usually it's up to the coordinator to report it, collect the data, those types of things. Commitment number 5 is training and informing the study team. This is a responsibility of the investigator. So as an investigator, be aware of what's available on campus. Talk with your study team. They're going to be able to tell you what they need. Having those regular meetings, whether it's monthly, quarterly, whatever works for your area. Find what works and get it scheduled. But you need to talk about regulations, making sure they're being followed, documenting training. We don't always do a good job on this. If you do training, make sure you document it. It can be a simple memo. It can be an email filed with your regulatory documents. If you do any type of training in the study team, document it so that it's there. If it's not documented, it's not done, for sure. This leads into maintaining adequate and accurate records. This is the responsibility of the investigator, but it's typically delegated to either the coordinator, the regulatory person, or data manager. Making sure your study team, whoever has that responsibility, has a very organized system. And making sure all that stuff is kept standardized and available. So if the FDA comes in, the IRB comes in, it's easy to pull out and be prepared. You're going to commit to making sure that the IRB approvals are upheld and that communication is adhered to. So that's all, your IRB approvals, renewals, progress reports, all those things. Any changes promptly reported to the IRB. All those things, they need to be done, and they need to be documented and organized. You're going to comply with 21 CFR Part 312. So this is where you need to go to the Code of Federal Regulations and at least look at that one. But understand that these are three regulations that kind of intertwine with each other, and so really having a good understanding of these three will help you in the conduct of your research. And knowing that if any of those commitments are not withheld or upheld, you could have action as a criminal offense. And a lot of times, it's not intentional. Probably 90% of the time, somebody has not done it intentionally. It's just lack of education or lack of training or lack of communication. So make sure you've got that good communication and that training system in place.
So, like, you do this and submit or commit to those commitments if it's a sponsored study. Because, like, for me, as a principal investigator, I work in the ICU and I come up with a study idea and I implement a protocol myself. I develop it. And, I mean, who would I be committing to?
That would be the IRB.
Okay. So you have to do that by 1572 to the IRB?
No, so the 1572 is just if you're doing drug studies. It's just a document that if you're doing drug studies, that is what the sponsor gives you and you complete with the sponsor and the FDA. If you're doing investigator projects like that, you need to uphold the same commitments. You're not signing a document, you're not sending it. But those are the commitments of an investigator doing research. That falls under those good clinical practice guidelines. So if those things aren't upheld, then the person that would come for you would be the IRB. That's where, I mean, in the sponsored ones, I think tend to be a little easier. It's clear guidelines. There is somebody there that is holding you accountable. They are telling you, no, you can't do this. No, that's not right. The investigator-initiated projects are great projects. That's where we get a lot of our ideas. It's innovative. There are so many things that we can do there. But the guidelines around it aren't as strict. It's a little more flexible. So that's where, it's as an investigator, you have to know what you have to uphold, because if something isn't done.
I want to add to that, Cindy. So our IRB, what Cindy's talking about, those guidelines, our IRB upholds those guidelines through all their documents that they do. So what you're talking about doing is there's a human subjects protocol that would be filled out, completed. There's other forms for our IRB that's completed. So you're making a commitment to our IRB, who is upholding to those regulations, those FDA, all of those people, to say that they're going to make sure you're doing the work according to the regulations. So you know how you have to do your continuing education with the IRB and those kind of things. A lot of those include those GCPs. So it is different. It's just not as blatant out there because you don't have a sponsor coming in and saying, okay, let me smack your hand, you're not doing this right, you're not doing this right. The IRB may come into you at some point and say, I want to review your stuff. So it's a little different, but the guidelines remain the same across the board for what we have to do. Does that make sense?
So then, like these CFRs, would they apply to projects like that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where the investigator that I talked about in one of the areas I worked in, it was an investigator-initiated protocol, and he, like, I didn't know I had to do that. I'm like, well, you do. So it wasn't that he blatantly did it, and it wasn't in a format that it was outlined. He didn't sign anything educating them. So what we did is educate them. And then as a result, the division implemented an education program for new faculty because it's not as blatant as if you're doing an industry-sponsored one. And so you still have to uphold those same guidelines. Other questions?
I have a couple of questions. On some grants I've seen PI, co-PI, and then sub-investigator. What is really the difference between the three of those?
So the PI is the primary investigator, but a lot of times they'll do a co-PI where they share those responsibilities. So it would be two investigators that have developed the grant or written the protocol, and they're sharing the responsibility and ownership of the investigator. A sub-investigator is somebody who is basically a colleague or assisting with the conduct of the study. So a lot of times the sub-investigator might be, somebody that's over in radiology, and they might be responsible for design of a portion of that study and analysis of the results. So the sub-investigator falls under the principal investigator.
Does the sub-investigator have to be a PhD or an MD?
No. The sub-investigator can be, in some areas, it's a nurse, be a nurse practitioner, can be a data manager, biostatistician. The definition for the sub-investigator is anybody who assists or helps in the conduct of the study in a significant way. They're really...
It's a researcher?
It could be. And I think in years past, people would be a sub-investigator because it would help them get on publications. So that's where it's truly somebody that is helping, playing a critical role in the conduct of the study.
Cindy, does our IRB allow co-investigators? Because I know one time they didn't. So I think our IRB only allows sub. So there are some institutions that allow the co. Now I don't know if this is still, it used to be that when you had a the primary investigator is still responsible, but the co-investigator in some worlds carried a little bit more responsibility as, along with the PI. And I think that's why our institution says clearly the PI is responsible for everything and delegating even to the sub-investigator coordinators and everything. So ultimately it comes back to that one person. They don't want it to be more than one person.
In Word for industry studies, it's only one person. Because they want to tie it to one specific person that they can go to.
On IRB, like renewing for the year, how long does it typically take UAB to approve that and send it back if it's not industry funded?
If it's a renewal, it could depend.
It depends on what it is.
Yeah, it depends on what it is.
Expedited, or is it human subjects?
Human subjects.
2 to 6 weeks, depending on when you submit it and when it's going to be reviewed.
Or if they're going through a lot of flux over there hiring people.
Yeah. Do y'all know, do they do it based on the expiration date, or if you send it a month early, would they do it a month early?
They would do it if you send it. The only thing is you don't want to send it too early because that moves your date up the next year. So you want to send it early, but not like 2 or 3 months early. Like a month early is good. Any other questions about investigator? Okay, so we've got a research nurse coordinator. A nurse coordinator, research coordinator, it might be a nurse, might not be a nurse. And so this person is usually specialized in research. They have a lot of the same responsibilities. They have a lot of responsibility delegated to them from the PI. So typically when you think about a research team, you think of a really good PI and a really good coordinator. If you have a strong coordinator as an investigator, you can really accomplish a lot with your study. They are usually, it's a good team, and you have to have a close relationship with communication in conducting the study. The PI is still responsible, like we talked about, but the coordinator is that key person in a group to really help the investigator. They have a wide range of responsibility as well. Administrative, involved maybe in the scientific portion of things, protocol preparation, maybe the financial component, the conduct of the research for sure, data collection possibly, reporting, and then project closeout. They are usually that key person between the investigator and the sponsor, the investigator and the participant, so they have a key role in the study. If you're lucky enough in your area to have a regulatory administrator, so somebody that just handles the regulatory for you, this person might manage and maintain all the documentation. They might be involved in maybe processing invoices, whether it be IRB invoices or maybe other financial invoices. They keep track of all the licenses, permits, all those types of things that need to be kept for documentation's sake. They capture a lot of signatures on all the forms that need to be maintained. And there is a high level of confidentiality in this position, and that's where I kind of talked about when you think about confidentiality and protecting subjects, it goes across the study team. And the regulatory manager sees a lot of documents with participants' names or other names related to the study, and so there's confidentiality in that position that we tend to forget about. Data manager, if you're lucky enough to have a data manager, this could be somebody that creates data collection forms, enters the information, manages queries, works with monitors to resolve queries, maybe perform some quality assurance on study documents. And so if you have a data manager, that is a really critical role. A lot of times the coordinator is the data manager. A financial administrator, and so this might be somebody that's specific to your study team. It might be somebody that is specific to your division or your department, depending on how it's structured. But this person really balances the books. They keep track of the funds. And a lot of times, as investigators, we tend to forget about the financial component, but it's critical to understand your finances and know what's in your account and what's coming in and what's going out and what things are costing. The financial person is a key person to help in that understanding. They can help with subject compensation, building budgets, tracking budgets, invoicing sponsors, and really helping in that feasibility and maintenance of budgets. Laboratory technician, this person can help with collection and processing of samples. It might also be somebody that helps with the design of a type of analysis that needs to be done or how the study is going to be designed. And they can also handle shipping and things like that, tracking of things. A pharmacist, if you're not aware, the university does have a research pharmacy. If you don't use the research pharmacy, I would highly encourage you to get some information about it and use it if you can. If you have a sponsored study, a sponsor will pay for the research pharmacy, so use them. Understand if it's investigator initiated, the funds might not be there. But the research pharmacy, it's in West Pavilion, North Pavilion. You can have the drug shipped there. They track the drug. They keep the logs. They monitor the temperature logs. They handle randomization. They handle dispensing. So if you have a drug study or you're using a study that has a drug, consider using the research pharmacy. We talked about documentation. You're going to hear a lot about it, but make sure you document what everybody is doing. If you have a sponsored study, typically they'll give you a log. It's called the Delegation of Authority log, and this is where you document what the person's name in the study, what their role is, and what responsibilities they have. If you're working with a federal study or an investigator-initiated study, it's a good idea to just create that log yourself. I think in your handouts, in your binder, we gave some examples. But somehow document what your study team is doing and who is responsible for what. And communicate. And this is always challenging no matter what area you are in. But find a way for your team to communicate. When I was in cardiology, we had 6 sections, and each section was very different. So we managed research for the entire division. We couldn't just have one meeting for everybody in the division. We tailored how we met with each section. So one area wanted to meet weekly, one area wanted to meet quarterly, one wanted to meet monthly. So find what works for your team. Maybe it's a weekly email on updates and a monthly meeting. Maybe it's, a quarterly meeting with intermittent emails. Find what works, but make sure you document it. And when you have that meeting, it's simple meeting etiquette. Have an agenda. Stick to the time frame. Talk about what's working and what's not working. That's when you want to talk about the finances. You want to talk about recruitment. You want to talk about the protocol and deviations, monitor reports, all these things. You need to make the best use of that time. Be aware of any training. So if you're here, you have probably completed HSP training and GCP training. You might, once you get into things, the study that you're working on, you might have protocol-specific training. You might have to do impact training if you're using the EMR. And then there might be other specific training you have to take based on your study or your responsibilities. So there's a heck of a lot of training. Make sure you document it. And then be aware of training that's going on campus and participate in those when you can. Hopefully you've learned that PI, again, ultimately responsible. The coordinator is responsible for all aspects of helping the PI implement the study, and everyone on the research team is responsible for the conduct of the study. Any questions?
I have one more question about tracking the training. In my lab, I haven't really heard anything about this. So you're saying that IRB could come in and say who's trained on what and where documenting this?
And so there's a delegation, an example of a delegation log in the handouts. But it can be a real simple, table or spreadsheet that has what the person's name is, what their role is on the study, investigator, lab technician, data manager, coordinator, and what responsibilities they're conducting. Are they consenting? Are they processing labs? Are they collecting data? Are they seeing patients, conducting visits? So just make sure you have
documentation. You just make it how you want it.
The formal part of it comes from if you have a sponsored study and they give one to you. But, you don't want it on a piece of scrap paper.
Right.
But using one of the tables. Do you guys have any?
You're just overall talking about training log, is that what you're saying? Yeah, I would
A
just,
delegation and a training log?
yeah, just have a log and make sure your training is documented on what you're,
What they will ask for, especially if it's a monitoring, they will ask also for documentation, like where's a description of the course that you took. So is there a certificate that you received from taking that course? They may, again, you've got a law, but you kind of need the source document, which is the,
So is that just specific to IRB training and continuing education, or would you have to log things within the lab, like this person was trained on experiment 1, this person was trained on data entry?
usually we don't go that specifically. It depends. We have a study where you have to be certified to enter the data. So you're going to have documentation for that certification. Other protocols don't have that. So it's going to be kind of protocol specific, would you say?
And then if you're, so in a lab, if maybe you have a regular lab meeting and you have an agenda, save the agendas and write down who attended the meeting. Because that could document, well, on this day we talked about how this experiment is going to be run and how the analysis is going to be done. And then,
so generally I would say too that, we've talked about, investigator initiated versus the sponsor studies. You just kind of mirror to a certain degree when you're doing an investigator study to make sure you have the documentation that we're telling you is required for the investigating for the sponsored studies. So your training log, however it is that you do it, somebody like our IRB, or with me I do a lot of NIH studies, so they can just come in and train, or come in and do an audit.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to sometimes develop your own documents to make sure that you have everything in order. And like in my department, we do biopsies. So there's a particular, like you're talking about the lab, so there's particular training that has to be done for the person actually doing the muscle biopsy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then signed off, how many times did this person do it? So you have to develop your own training program if you have specific things within your department and make sure that's documented.
Okay. So their name listed on the HSP wouldn't be enough?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
And then the other thing you have to think about is if you change the protocol, so if you make an amendment, some type of revision, they want to see that everybody that was listed on that HSP or part of that study team is made aware of that change.
Yeah.
And so that can be, an email that you've kept where you've circulated that change, highlighting the change and having everybody on the team respond back that yes, they've read it. We've done everything where we put it on a PowerPoint slide and have people sign in at a meeting that we were having, or sending it to them and asking them to complete a form, and then we go pick up the form. So kind of what works best for your investigators or your team.
And that is something that gets lost a lot. It's
Yeah.
that amendment or a new version of the protocol. Everybody's already been trained on it, and you only made a few changes, but you need to document. So the monitors, the auditors will look for that everybody's still trained. One of the challenges we've been coming up with lately is the new requirement for GCP training and the pushback on who needs to have that. And that's really important to filter through with your sponsor. Right now, it's everybody needs it. Anybody who's working on a research study, even those folks in the lab, because it's still applicable in so many ways. But know what your protocol expects of you. The protocol should, and the sponsor should tell you what training is required. It's going to vary per protocol.
Has everybody taken GCP training? Yeah. Because it was January 1st, it was required for everything. In the past, it was definitely required for industry. So NIH, anything that has to go through the IRB, you're going to have completed GCP.
So you're going forward, the IRB, anybody who's listed on the IRB is going to be required to have GCP before.
Any other questions? No, well, you guys have a break. And then Carla Perna is going to talk next about pre-study activity.
Oh, this way.
And out there and to the right. Like go back to the front door.
Okay, go right, thanks. Are y'all saying that?
Hey, you're here.
Oh, no.
They're on the IRB. So they're on that HSP form.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe between 1 and 2. Okay. I have a 3:30.
Oh, okay.
All right, I know. Bless you. No worries, maybe. You're the next charge person who's going to pack. It'll be somebody who knows. Well, I don't think it was fire.
Well, actually, in the
We send our, if they package our blood for us, like we send it out, we set draws it and then ships it. They need to be on our HSP and.
So the way, on Monday, we used to put so when we had it, we were doing an outreach lab, we had to put an outreach lab on the IRB. Well, we did, we wanted them on, delegated to do stuff. So they didn't even have stuff. The lab itself went on the 15-22. But we would put the lab manager, maybe one in contact with one of the delegates. We would put her on the delegation log, and then we have a memo that says she trains all of the staff doing the processing, and this is the training that we're conducting beforehand. And so sometimes once was sufficient, sometimes we have to go back and on the sponsor and train, train again, basically to say, here's the training.
And I need to stay on them.
Right, yeah. But if they actually are on the true HSP, then they're going to have
So Monday from 5 to 7.
Thursday,
Monday. We could have the 900 counselor.
Oh, yeah, I gotta get it on my calendar.
which is what I misunderstood your text. I thought I was doing the other one and you were doing the girls one. Oh, no, she's like, okay. Oh, no, she meant, okay.
So Monday the 30th.
I'm sorry, thank you.
And that's in PCAMS?
Yes, ma'am. It's all, it is here, 8 to noon. But I told her she had something that we just.
But that's on the 9th.
At least 10.
But Monday is 5 to 7.
Yeah.
I thought we should make sure all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are they having food?
Well, we could.
I can.
But see, he doesn't drink. He's told me that before. It's a real problem.
Yeah,
I still might ask him. Probably. I have somebody that's not well, like, I'm trying to listen to the everything else with CCRC. And y'all try to get rid of that patient.
Are they
It can be
hard copy
email.
email?
No email.
No?
You got to say the date?
No.
You didn't get to say the date?
No.
Oh, I'm so glad I'm talking to you.
When is it?
What's this? It's the 21st of February.
Okay, good, we have plenty of time.
But, we've got, what's next for doing?
Brandon.
On Brandon's group? Yeah.
He's doing
Or
it.
the first one. Yeah, they're collecting all the addresses and sending out the invites and stuff.
Yeah, I haven't gotten anything.
Well, you're both on the list, so that's a little worrisome.
Unless it went to,
Okay, come on.
the UAB MC filters a few things out, but I always check it.
Okay, I'm gonna have to check on that.
But maybe it's not UAB MC.
Right, I know.
She's Pete, so
Where'd you get that lucky blanket?
I grabbed it on my house.
Okay.
There's water out here.
There's nothing. February 9th. 8
8 to 10. Yeah. It's here. And then Monday night here. So. I don't even know if he's right.
Right. So I was actually
I saw that.
last year.
I said, but she's not going to do all of her research.
Yeah, I don't know if they know really what they would do with me right now.
Yeah, Rob's
He's very nice. He's funny. You know, I mean, that's a, you know, for you. So I'm just gonna order, yeah. Make sure that it's.
Yeah. Oh, I'm already in pizza.
Oh, okay. What is it? No, so I I'm all
Oh, yeah, you know, I know. Does everyone get their pre-test? If you have.
Oh, they need like, and we were talking about
Yeah, they,
Pre-test? Oh. Oh, I did, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You are. I did it very well.
Drink some powder. Get some.
Yeah, you need to do that. That's what you are. No, I was just saying. I'll give you a moment. You can just keep drinking Coke.
My goal is the ice inside. That's the only
FWL.
Frank, Wally, and Leonard.
How many are they all? But then she went to the road.
They have like, experience around any cancel.
I guess blue, rain. I go like, excuse me, a humble person girl and I love her. But I'm pretty sure
They're Canadian, they're 24/7.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But she's very second. Yeah. I'm like, I thought I was kissing leaves. He's fine.
You have a problem?
Okay, guys, we're going to get started. A little bit about myself. My name's Carla Kerna, and I'm the Center Administrator for the Center of Exercise Medicine here at UAB. I worked in the Cancer Center for 8 years, and I was the administrator there for the Clinical Trials Division. So I've been doing the exercise medicine side, the grant side, the NIH side of work now since March. So currently I don't work with industry studies, but I've done that for many, many years. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about pre-study activities and getting ready for your study. And again, although we're really focusing on industry, you can take this, what we're giving you, and just look at it as a guideline for any time you're doing a research study and try to develop process and procedures. I can't stress the standardization enough. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whichever department you're in, that you come up with your standardization process so that everybody's doing the same thing. All right, so as we've talked about, well, first thing we want to know is what type of research are we doing? And there's all different types of research that we can do, and I've listed several of them here. And when you talk about the IRB, some of these can be expedited studies. Let's just say that you're looking at something where you're just collecting data. It's still a research study, but it can be expedited and not take a full IRB review. So in the Cancer Center, we did a lot of drug studies, which is treatment studies. And then there's many other places at UAB that does the prevention. So these, I think you have your handout, so you can just look at these. This is not all inclusive, but I wanted you to be aware that not every research study we do is a treatment study. So that I want you to be able to identify your tasks required to start a study, whatever the research study is. And I want you to be able to identify the difference between an investigator-initiated study, as we were talking about earlier, or an industry study that's already developed. So an investigator-initiated study is a study where can be at our institution or an institution that we're collaborating with, that investigator or PI has actually written the study. So it's developing. So they collaborate. They work together to write a protocol and get the protocol funded. And industry is Pfizer, Amgen. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about developed studies. And they actually give you the guidelines and tell you what to do. In fact, they will be very adamant about what they want you to do. And sometimes you have to push back and say, these are our SOPs, these are our procedures, these are our policies. Because then you'll get all over the place in your standardizations of what you're doing within your group can kind of go awry. So following those GCPs, as we mentioned before, and I think is the most critical thing, that you have to develop your own processes, and we'll be getting into that a little bit in a minute. So what is a feasibility assessment? You're going to have to excuse me. I'm taking sinus medicine, and mouth is so dry. It's time to do your feasibility statement. All right. So what you want to do is you want to look at you want to analyze your proposed project and overview of your primary issues. And you also want to look at it, can it be successful or can it not be, successful? Because it's a business decision, right? You want to know, you're obviously going to answer a scientific question, but you want to know if it fits into your portfolio and what you're doing. You've got to be very thorough, and I believe Cindy mentioned the word objective a few times, very important. And again, you're going to hear me use the word systematic a lot, and consistent. So throughout your project, whatever you design, whatever your processes are, you're being systematic and consistent is very important for success. Okay, so you're considering the protocol, and you want to know if it's feasible. So one of the things you want to know is, do I have the personnel to do this? We work sometimes in big groups like the Cancer Center, where I had a regulatory manager, I had a budget manager, I had a financial manager, but a lot of places like where I work now, the coordinator is a one-stop shop. So from soup to nuts, that coordinator is doing everything, all the way up through the participants. And there's a lot of places, I would say more so than not on campus, that do that, where the coordinator is actually doing a lot of the work. So you have to look at the workload, and you have to say, do I have the people to be able to do this and do it efficiently? And obviously money is important. We have to be able to pay our people to do the work. And how much do we need? So that's preparing that budget. And do I have the population? Is your study a population where you have an N of 10, or do you want, do you just need an N of 5? What are you doing? Just a small little data study, or it just depends on what you're doing to figure out how many subjects. If you don't have the subject population, you're already going into it with a big, maybe I shouldn't do this. Facilities. As Cindy mentioned, you can use the research pharmacy, the lab. There's different places across campus. Do you have a DEXA scan, a CT scan, an MRI? Where all can you get that done? And is this something that is feasible for you to be able to get your participants to and from? Those logistics about running the trial, where you're located, where you have to take them to get a biopsy, where you have to take them to get the MRI, all of those kind of things need to be looked to see. And a lot of times what I do myself, if I was asked to be in this study, would I really think about being in it? And what would be my holdup for being in this study? And if you can think of it from that kind of perspective, sometimes it may be that it's not feasible logistically to have somebody come in and go 10 different places to do what they need to do for the study. Also depends on the population you're using. If there's younger participants, or if there's older participants, or if they're handicapped in any way. So a lot of things to consider. All right, I don't want you to ignore the red flags. So you always want to have a good, firm scientific question. If you don't have a good, if it's questionable, right off the bat, I wouldn't do it. If you got a sponsor coming to you and saying, hey, I need you to recruit 3 people a month, and you're looking at your subject population and you're saying, your portfolio, and you know that you can't meet that responsibility, well, A, you need to let the sponsor know that, because they're the ones putting out the money for it, and it's just only right that you let them know that. And if you have a huge portfolio like they do in the Cancer Center, you may have 4 different studies that you can take a patient and put on, and you want to know what type of patient you're putting here, here, and here. So you want to look at that entire portfolio, and it may not be that you can do this. Inadequate budgets. We don't do anything for free around here. All of us have to get paid. So if they're not willing to pay what you need to get the study done, exit off. This right here, from an administrative perspective, is what I do, or what I did when I did industry studies, is went through and looked at all of these specific things, and then talked with the physicians and said, this isn't feasible for us to do. And if they didn't agree and they came back and figured out how we could do it, then we might move forward. But a lot of times you can have one person to do these to go through these questions and not even involve your staff and keep your staff working. The not appealing to participants and subjects, and I'll give you all an example. We had a particular grant that we were trying to look at, and what I do is rehabilitation medicine for exercise. So take muscular sclerosis patients, or MS patients, or you might have a Parkinson's patient, and we had an investigator come to us, and I mean, it was literally 4 muscle biopsies a week for these patients. Overall, there was going to be over 20 muscle biopsies in this study. Now, I can tell you, I wouldn't do that. I mean, I would not, there's no way I would do that, although it's not a huge procedure, but I think that's a lot to ask of our patients, especially a patient that has difficulty getting around. So those are one of the things you have to think about when you're looking at your studies. And again, know your population, lack of patient pool. All right. So this might be a little bit outdated. I know that we have a new IRB director, and I'm hoping that this is something that, along with our CTAO and our IRB, that they're going to work on. But it's still available, and it's called the Clinical Protocol Activation Process, and it's on the IRB website. And this is a document that actually walks you through, if you need samples done, if you need to have a CT scan, this is who you contact, this is what you do. It's still a good guidance document, but as I said, it might need some updating, so I wanted to make sure that you knew about the CPAP. So we're going to begin the study. What is the first thing that we do? Well, we have to have a confidentiality agreement. You can have a one-way confidentiality agreement. That one-way confidentiality agreement might be that the Pfizer is saying, I'm going to share my information with UAB, and UAB doesn't need to share this information with anywhere else. Pfizer might be coming on campus, talking to one of our investigators who has a great idea. Pfizer's drug, our idea. It's a two-way confidentiality agreement. This is what Pfizer can do. So there's different ways to do a CDA, but this CDA is required for an industry study for here at UAB. That's the first step. And then you're going to receive the protocol and you're going to review that protocol. And this is where I was telling you about the feasibility. Whenever a sponsor approaches you for a study and they tell you, you know, I can't give you the protocol until I have a CDA in place, obviously we understand why they do that. But once you get the protocol, you should have enough information to go through those feasibility questions and ask yourself, is this something feasible? And you can make a decision if you're going to go or not go. But if you decide to go forward, if it's a good scientific question, you think you have the population, at this point you may not have a draft budget, then you're going to ask them to get these other documents in, look at consent, what the patient's going to have to go through. Are the patients going to be paid for travel? All kinds of things like that. And what is required of your staff? Now, as I said, we have some flexibility in creating our own SOPs and sharing them with our sponsors and telling them this is what we do here at UAB. For instance, if we do electronic filing versus manual filing. There may be some of them that say, oh, no, I'm still going to fax. I'm like, I don't even have a fax machine. What do you know, sorry. You know, I don't know where you came from, but we don't fax anymore. Let's email. So there can be little things, but once you get this is something from an administrative perspective, or you may have a protocol reviewer in your office that actually does this for you and makes the decision. And then again, you're deciding if you're going to go. So if you decide to move forward with the study, you're going to submit to the Office of Sponsored Programs here at UAB, and that's where you do their submission packet, which is online and guides you very clearly on everything that they need to be able to submit, get your contract going. And again, Cindy mentioned to you that if we have an investigator-initiated study, we keep those in-house here at UAB. They are looking at potentially making some form of change with that, but that's a whole other subject. But right now, that is what we do. If it is industry, it does go to work. The only caveat is if it's got a gene component, a gene therapy component here, we do keep those in-house. Those have to be monitored very frequently, and our IRB wants to have their finger on, you know, the pulse of those studies. Very, very critical to timelines when it comes to a sponsor. So one of the things that a sponsor is going to ask you when they give you their feasibility questionnaire, whether they're going to choose you for a site, is they're going to ask you questions of how quickly can you get us started? How fast can we go? The general industry standard right now is they want you up and running within 90 days. All right. Sometimes that can, you know, you could run into 120 days here at the UAB IRB, and depending on what the feasibility is of that. The reason they want that 90 days up and running is because they've chosen you for a site, which means they haven't chosen someone else. And they may have the money just to choose 5 sites. And if they say, UAB, you've won this project, they want to make sure that they're not putting their money into UAB for UAB just to hold, you know, to take their money and not give them the data, because that's what they're paying us for, is the data. So critical to meeting those startup times is to work in tandem. So as I said, sometimes we have, you know, the one-stop shop, but if you can work on getting your budget prepared and get the contract going out the door, and you got the IRB and the regulatory working together. Here at UAB, we have to have an IRB approval before we can get a final contract. So if you can get that going and working in tandem, working together and communicating and trying to meet the timeline that you tell the sponsor that you would need. And then this is where you're going to have your site initiation visit. Now, SIV is very, focused on an industry study. If it's an investigator-initiated study, what we're going to do is a startup. And the startup could be with an internal team. It could be with your research pharmacist involved. It could be, you may have a radiologist involved who needs to measure, for instance, in cancer, it could be a tumor. You want one radiologist doing the very same measurement at the same time. So your team can involve your lab person, your coordinator, many different people. Okay, so regulatory. I've had people tell me, you know, many times, I have no clue why you like what you do. This is crazy. There's so much paper, and this is exactly what it feels like sometimes. It's like there's a machine just pumping it out constantly, and you've got to try to figure out how to get it going, and you're like, I don't know where to start. So in the research world, we all know that if you're not type A, a little anal, a little bit too organized, you're probably not going to like research. Research is very regimented, and you really need to be able to have Again, that word, systematic and constant processes, consistent processes that you have in place. All right, so in the clinical trial, when you do a clinical trial, you have essential regulatory documents. I've marked here the clinical, it's GCP, Good Clinical Practice Part 8. The investigator back, I'm sorry, I forgot your name already. This is something that I was trying to mention that is very critical that everybody who's doing the study understands, because if you're doing research, this applies across the board. It doesn't matter if it's an industry study or not. So there's GCP standards, there's applicable regulatory requirements. As I mentioned before, I do a lot of NIH studies, so what's required for me is applicable to me for an NIH study might not be exactly applicable to an industry study, right? So there's difference between those regulatory requirements. But the underlying what we do is pretty consistent. And also, if you have these essential regulatory documents in your binder filed, that supports the credibility of your team. We talked a little bit ago about our training document. If you train, you have a training process, you have it written, you document that people are getting trained. If somebody comes in to audit you and to monitor you, it supports, my team knows what they're doing. You have to have a good, well-trained team is one of the best tools you can have in your toolbox. And it allows the sponsor and whoever the regulatory authorities are that's coming in, the FDA, NIH, whoever, they evaluate how are you conducting the trial, and are you really getting quality data, and help you evaluate that. Again, document retention is required for the study site, and there's document retention that's required for the sponsor. The sponsor's going to tell you what they need. Again, remember that you can have your own processes for how you file and what you do with your studies. Be systematic, consistent in your processes. If the sponsor tells you they want the monitors to come in and have 6 binders this tall, and your processes are, we file electronically, and we'll have things ready, that's an SOP you need to have in your office, and that's something you need to share with your sponsor up front. So if you're involved in an investigational new drug, or in cardiology or other places, you can have an IDE, you can have a device exemption. One important thing to know about between industry and an IIT is there's several people who can be a sponsor. It can be a company like Novartis. If you're doing a Medtronic trial for the defibrillator, they could be the sponsor. NIH can be the sponsor, and also Dr. UAB can be the sponsor. So there's several people who can be the sponsor, the sponsor of the study. Please remember Dr. UAB has the same responsibilities as an industry sponsor. So here again, we got the same thing. The PI, the responsibilities that are required by the PI, whether it's industry or not, are the same. I forgot I had that in there and scared myself. That was perfect. Okay, this is the point where, I stuck this in here because I've thrown out so much information. You're probably going, we've had 3 presentations and you're just trying to get it all. But that's probably the best reaction I've ever had as my own to that. You will feel this way sometimes, and you don't know, but we have a great group of people here at UAB, all of us in this room, all of us that are coffee tea, good collaborative group that will help you get through what you need to. So even though you feel like this, go into a room, scream, pull your hair, whatever you have to do, know that you have the resources. Let's not panic. Again, my consistent theme, organization and consistency.